Okay, so what I want to talk about now is Thomas Jefferson and what he wrote in his notes on the state of Virginia. And as the state was developing, his thoughts for how the state would develop and grow and mature. Particularly, I'm going to read some parts about the education system in Virginia that he envisioned and he thought would be um, very beneficial and helpful for the states. This was actually put into a bill and it was proposed for the state of Virginia. I'm going to read a few clips, a few excerpts here from the things that Thomas Jefferson wrote. It's really fascinating. Our education system today, actually, in many respects, follows this pattern, but it has since been blown out of proportion. So he says this bill proposes to lay off every county into small districts of 5 or 6 miles square called hundreds, and in each of them to establish a school for teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. Basically, have little basically he's forming school districts that he calls hundreds in 5 or 6 miles square. And then he goes on, he says, the tutor, so each of these hundreds, this geographical school district basically has a tutor assigned to it or hired for it. The tutor to be supported by the hundreds, and every person in it entitled to send their children 3 years gratis and as much longer as they please, paying for it. The idea is to get some basic education to the children. 3 years would be free. And then from there on, if you were going to continue to be educated by the tutor, you would have to pay for it. So the idea being here is the tutor would always have some students that would continue on beyond the 3 years and would have a source of income. And it says these schools to be under a visitor who is annually to choose the boy of best genius in the school, of whose parents are too poor to give them further education, and to send him forward to one of the grammar schools, of which 20 are proposed to be erected in different parts of the country for teaching Greek, Latin, geography, and the higher branches of numerical arithmetic. He's basically outlining here a system. You have your little school districts, and then you have a tutor that would take care of those students. The first 3 years would be free, and then after that, parents would pay for their students to continue to receive more education. And then he would actually have, perhaps someone from a school board, but a visitor would go to the different area and select a student that showed a lot of promise, that was very intelligent, but their family was too poor to pay for education, and select that student to come to grammar school so they could get a more complete education. And that would be done on the public taxpayer dime. It's interesting the topics that they would study and choose, which most of those aren't the topics that we do in our school systems today. So I'm going to skip down a little bit further here. It says the ultimate result of the whole scheme of education would be the teaching all the children of the state reading, writing, and common arithmetic, turning out 10 annually of superior genius well taught in Greek, Latin, geography, and the higher branches of arithmetic or math, turning out 10 others annually of still superior parts, who to those branches of learning shall have added such of the sciences as their genius shall have led them to. He's basically saying we need a system where if students choose to advance, if they choose to learn more, that they have that opportunity. And those best students can be selected from off the top and they can go and get more education. And those that really don't care, or it's really not their cup of tea to sit in school all day, they can go do other things, but they still need that basic education. And so Thomas Jefferson saying, let's educate the masses. Everyone needs an education to a certain degree, but if their talents or their skills or interests lie somewhere else, don't hold them in school. It's not worth it. Pick the 10 best, and then we're going to pick another 10 that are even higher above that 10. We're going to give them opportunities to expand into other subjects and topics that they may be able to continue their education and hopefully contribute to their state. He goes on, he says, turning out 10 others annually of still superior parts, who to those branches of learning shall have added such of the sciences as their genius shall have led them to. So, we're not forcing this upon them. It's not because they're good at it. It's because they have a desire for it and they have a natural talent for it. Let's see, the furnishing to the wealthier part of the people convenient schools at which their children may be educated at their own expense. So he says, we will furnish some schools that wealthier people can send their students to, but it'll be at their expense. It won't be on the taxpayer dime. But we want to make sure that there's a school in each geographical pocket. This next phrase is really fascinating to what Thomas says next. So listen to this very carefully. I think this is very key. He says, the general objects of this law, so he's talking about the laws of the state of Virginia, are to provide an education adapted to the years to the capacity and the condition of everyone, which is absolutely amazing. We don't really do that today in many respects, and directed to their freedom and happiness. Wow. That's pretty novel. In theory, in our school system today, we do this. In practice, I don't know. It can be a question mark, and it can depend on the school, it can depend on the teacher, it can depend on what the system's doing. So education's adapted to the years, right? And adapted to the capacity. We certainly adapt to the years pretty well in our school system for the most part, but there's some challenges there. But to the capacity, so each student has different learning capacities and the condition of everyone. Some of us may have physical needs, mental needs that require extra care and attention, and others of us may be very self-directed and be able to learn very quickly. So there's some conditions there to take into effect, which Thomas was very well aware of. But this next part is really fascinating, where he says, directed to their freedom and happiness. Directed to their freedom and happiness. Wow. Our school system today, a lot of what we do with our students is mandatory, it's required. We force education upon our students. But Thomas Jefferson is saying quite the opposite. Our students should be self directed according to their freedom and happiness. And we just don't do that in our public school systems today. It is a system of compulsion and requirement mandated by the law, and you get yourself in big trouble if you don't go to public school. And you're forced to learn all these topics you may not have any interest in. But Thomas Jefferson is saying education, the power of real education is when you have the freedom, the liberty to go and explore on your own, and you're pursuing your happiness by gaining your education. I'm just going to throw in a quick story here. When I used to live in Massachusetts, we had a great family friend, and he served in the Coast Guard. And we went to church with him. And in church, he actually got up and he told some of the young men, he was in charge of the ministry for the young men. And he told some of the young men, he's like, you know what? Today's schools isn't for everyone. College isn't for everyone. And, if you ever think about the armed services or the Coast Guard, come and talk to me. I'd be happy to chat. And I wasn't expecting it, but that's what he said. And I just thought, you know what? There's a lot of wisdom in that. Some of us are just well suited for certain occupations, certain sciences, certain activities, certain careers where you're out and you're physical and you're active. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a lot of those people to go and get a college education. They're much happier doing something else. They have great skills and talents in other fields. It could be, the trades. It could be in the military. There's a lot of options out there. But I thought that was really fascinating. And I just reminded of that experience reading this from Thomas Jefferson. So he goes on, he says, specific details were not proper for the law. Specific details were not proper for the law. So what's he saying there? Thomas Jefferson's basically saying, don't get in the weeds on education. It's not proper. You don't have to spell out everything in minute detail. But yet, education today, that's what we're doing. We spill out things in minute detail, and we expect students to do more and more at younger and younger ages. It's really bizarre. Thomas Jefferson's all in favor of education should be about freedom and happiness, and the law should be very vague about what it requires, because it's mostly a private matter, is what he's saying. And he goes on, so we'll continue reading here. He says, these must be the business of the visitors entrusted with its execution. So he says you would have these visitors would be he doesn't specify, but if you had a visitor who worked with the schools, someone who was well educated themselves, and they could determine, they would have good judgment on how these students are learning, who are the best students, what are their fields that they really excel in, or their areas of scholarship that they really excel in, and let's select those and help them move on in the system. So it's a really step-by-step system that's really beneficial. It allows people to only go as far as they really need to, or as they really want to, or as far as their freedom and happiness demands of them. So it's really kind of a beautiful system here. So I know this is a lot, but hang with me here. So I'm going to read a little bit more. So he says, the first stage of this education being the schools of the hundreds, wherein the great mass of the people will receive their instruction. The principal foundations of future order will be laid here. So the principles of future order will be right here. So this would be like, today we would say elementary school or preschool. Like there's, this order of how education happens, and helping students be able to just develop the skills of learning is really important. And we're doing this for the masses because Thomas Jefferson really recognizes that, there can be a great divide between the rich and the poor. And oftentimes that's education. And that education is what allows the rich to become rich. And the lack of education is what keeps the poor poor. And so Thomas is saying, you know what, in America, where we have all this freedom and happiness, we need to have some sort of mechanism in place where people can get more education regardless of their economic status. And that's been a problem throughout the ages. And it doesn't matter what society, what country, that's always been an ongoing problem. And so here we have Thomas Jefferson, the genius, um, in his own right, saying, you know what, we need to pull out the geniuses that are out there regardless of their economic situation. And we need to allow them to study the fields that they need to study so that they can bless our society, so they can be fulfilled, they can be happy. And those who are content with other pursuits, with other occupations, we'll give them enough education to do that, and then give them the freedom to go and do it rather than keep holding them in the system and demanding that they get more education in other fields or in other specialties. So I think there's a lot of brilliance in that. So he goes on, he says, the principal foundations of future order will be laid here. Instead, therefore, of putting the Bible and Testament into the hands of the children, so he's talking about the New and Old Testament, which was very common education for Americans before and after the American Revolution. And that's really what most people had. They had their Bible, and so that's how you learned how to read was from the Bible. Um, but he's saying, a lot of the really heavy issues of religion and of salvation and everything at a very early age. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes children have a harder time of understanding that. So he's saying, we'll help them learn some other facts first, so kind of ramp up to it. Now, I don't think he's saying that you shouldn't teach children the Bible and religion at an early age. I don't think that's what he's saying. I'm just saying for the purposes of a public school, he says, I think this will be helpful, generally speaking, for everyone. So he goes on and he says, at an age when their judgments are not sufficiently mature for religious inquiries, their memories may therefore be stored with the most useful facts from the Grecian, Roman, European, and American history. The first elements of morality, too, may be instilled into their minds, such as, when further developed, as their judgments advance in strength, may teach them how to work out their own great happiness. Man, I'm totally blown away every time I read this because it's so foreign to what we have today in our education. So here he is. He's saying that religion is important. Thomas Jefferson was a disciple of Jesus Christ and a Christian for sure. Um, but he also recognized the need for all of these secular topics, all these temporal topics, and how important that they are. And so he's saying, we need to teach them about, ancient antiquity, about the classic, Roman and Grecian empires. We need to teach them about the European empires. We need to teach them about American history, how we got to where we're at now. And he says, on top of that, all that secular knowledge, we need to have training as to elements of morality. And so they can discern between what is right and what is wrong, the study of what is right and what is wrong. They need to have that experience here, even at the most basic level. And he says that as they advance, and they become better in their judgments, you will teach them more and more morality. And so as we go on here, he says, um, by showing them that it does not depend on the condition of life in which chance has placed them, but is always the result of a good conscience, good health, occupation, and freedom in all just pursuits. So Thomas Jefferson wants to prove to everyone, and he says that education has this catalyst effect of being able to help people move into making good judgments. They can choose between right and wrong. It also helps them to develop a good occupation, and then also to be able to maintain and improve their health, um, and have freedom freedom in society to buy and sell and trade and to socialize and to worship God how they would choose. And he says, in all just pursuits, anything that's just, worthy, praiseworthy. He says we want people to be able to grasp onto that, hold on to it, and execute on it. And he says we don't want people to feel like they're stuck in their situation. So education helps people realize that they're not stuck in the circumstances into which they are born, which has been the tragedy of the ages. If you read through a lot of the great works from a lot of the great authors over the centuries, over the millennia, that's a common theme. Um, it's a very common theme. Thomas Jefferson says, we've got to reverse this. We've got to change this. America's got to be different in the way we do education. So he goes on, he says, those whom either the wealth of their parents or the adoption of the state shall destine to higher degrees of learning will go on to the grammar schools. So he's basically saying, if you've been selected because of your good scholarship and your interest in these areas to go on and receive more education by the benefit of the state, then that's a wonderful, beautiful thing. Or if by the nature of your wealth, if you have the resources and you want to receive more education, you can go too and receive more education, but you're going to pay for it. Um, so Thomas Jefferson's outlining a system that would be very fair, very just system. Let's see. So he says, "Will go on to onto the grammar schools. Will constitute the next stage, there to be instructed in the languages. The learning Greek and Latin, I am told, is going into disuse in Europe." So the classic languages, Greek and Latin, he thought were very important because you can read those original texts in their original language that were so important. All the great classics from the Romans and Greeks that had so many powerful teachings in them. But I find this very fascinating. Is he's saying even in Europe, which has typically been the stronghold of education for the world up until Thomas Jefferson's time, Thomas Jefferson's saying, you know what? I hear the Europeans are getting rid of these languages. They're not studying them. They're not learning them anymore. And he says their education's starting to go down the tubes. It's not real great, which I find this fascinating because Europe's decline educationally has been more advanced than ours, but we've followed suit with Europe. As theirs has deteriorated, so has ours, and we've followed their pattern. And I'm going to explain in a moment why that is. Um, and so we have to be really careful. Um, you know, this decline away from real education, where you're reading the best books and you're reading the classics and you're studying the important languages and getting a foundation in reading, writing, and math and the sciences. All of that is just so critical to the success of a free nation, free country. But when we start departing from that, that's when problems start arising. So I'm going to read one more passage here, and then I'm going to go back to what we just read there and explain a little bit of the decline in education in America. So hang with me. I know this is heavy. I know this is a lot, but you can do this. Um, so he says a little bit later on, I'm jumping forward here. He says, as soon as they are of sufficient age, it is supposed that they'll be sent on from the grammar schools to the university, which constitutes our third and last stage. So first he's talking about the school of the hundreds, which is kind of your general, um, you know, elementary school is probably what we'd call it today. But you have a tutor, and then you have students from a little district that come together and they get tutored for free for the first 3 years. And then after that, those that want to go on can go to grammar school, where they go into more depth, learn the languages, and get a really good, solid classical education. And then the third step from there is jumping on to the university system. So they can go on and get specific training in a particular area. If they want to be a minister or a pastor, they can become more trained in the scriptures and the Bible. If they want to become an attorney, they can study the law, so on and so forth. And it says, which constitutes our third and last stage, there to study those sciences which may be adapted to their views, by that part of our plan which prescribes the selection of the use of genius from among the classes of the poor, we hope to avail the state of those talents which nature has sown as liberally among the poor as the rich. but which perish without use. I'll read that one more time. We hope to avail the state of those talents which nature has sown as liberally among the poor as the rich, but which perish without use, if not sought for and cultivated. So he's saying, intelligence is among humans everywhere, right? How people get to cultivate that and develop it a lot of times depends on their material riches or their material wealth. And so he says, if we have a system where those who are maybe come from a poor family, they can have an opportunity to learn and study more and be able to develop themselves, and they can move up through these three tiers and make something of themselves. And not only that, they'll benefit their fellow citizens, they'll benefit their state, they'll come up with inventions, they'll come up with better forms of government, so on and so forth, right? They'll be able to provide for their families. There's all sorts of benefits that come from a good education. So that's a few snippets from Thomas Jefferson out of his notes for the formation of the state of Virginia, and I think these are really fascinating because they help us understand how he's thinking. Now, Thomas Jefferson, he probably wrote the most of any of the founding fathers on education. There were certainly others that wrote quite a bit too, but I think he thought about it the most, and I think he was probably the most proactive in saying, "Hey, we need to do something for the masses as far as education goes." So Thomas Jefferson was our man in that regard.